Number 6, Mr. Carroll's in the room. This is a submission on the government's reforms of the urban and infrastructure planning system. So, first off, Nick, I'll ask you if you want to speak to your report.
2 minutes if I can.
Yep.
Just to give you a brief update. Talked very briefly the other day about this document and circulated a draft submission. Gareth Green, our Group Manager Environmental Services, has been working with Local Government New Zealand, who have a little working team looking at these proposed changes, and they're formulating a submission on behalf of Local Government New Zealand. Through that process, they've raised a couple of points which we, either haven't raised in our submission or haven't given as much weight to in our submission. So what I've done, hopefully be of some use, is I've taken the submission and I have made some track changes which have highlighted a couple of little points where we thought as officers we needed to add a little more emphasis. The first one on page 1 is... The first change on page 1 is a very minor change. Then as you go on to page 2, there's a comment about private plan changes, which we hadn't previously touched on, but came through this local government work. The reason we haven't touched on it is we haven't actually done a private plan change yet. Our district plans really only become operative in the last couple of years. What Local Government New Zealand have signalled is that once a private individual lodges a private plan change, the only way that council can influence that is by becoming a submitter if we wish to see elements changed. If we become a submitter, then that means that council can't sit as the decision maker. So what other councils around the country have experienced, who have had quite a lot of these private plan changes, is that they're almost automatically becoming submitters on these private plan changes and are essentially cutting themselves out of that decision-making process. As I say, it hasn't been a big issue for us, but it could well become a bit more of an issue in the next 5 to 10 years. As a result, we thought there was some value in highlighting and supporting local government's position on that issue. The third comment is around page 4, where we've just strengthened up some of our comments around affordability. The government for quite some time has been banging on about the Resource Management Act and the way that some councils are using the Resource Management Act in a way that actually adversely affects the affordability of residential housing. There's been concern about constraint on the market and that as a result driving up demand and price. The point that Local Government New Zealand has made and that we want to continue to emphasise is that the planning regime is just one of the factors in overall housing affordability. And we don't want the government to lose sight of the fact that it is just one of those factors. So if they're really concerned about affordability, they need to address some of those others as well. Then just to finish off, we've got a couple of changes on pages 11, 12 and 13. And the one on page 11 is really just inserting an example, a Taupo example. One of the things about making submissions to central government is you want to add some value. You don't just want to parrot what everyone else has done. And in Taupo, we've got a good example of the designation process with regard to Contact Energy. Contact Energy are a requiring authority under the Act, which means that they have the ability to go and designate land. And one of the things the government's looking at as part of this process is widening who can be a requiring authority. Mighty River Power is a good example of a company that's not a requiring authority. There's a bit of a conflict there in some respects, one power company versus another. They want to try and resolve some of those conflicts. All we've suggested by way of that example is that you don't necessarily need to be a requiring authority to actually build things, particularly things of national significance. The Tahara 2 power station is a really good example of where Contact Energy, who are a requiring authority, chose not to use those powers and instead went through the Board of Inquiry process, which we used to call the call-in process. Essentially, it went to the Board of Inquiry who made the final decision. Bypassed council, bypassed the Environment Court. The last couple of comments around pages 12 and 13 are really just strengthening up our position with regard to concept designations. It's an idea that's come through this process, primarily driven by infrastructure providers, to say, don't make us provide a huge amount of information at the start of the process when we get our designation. Rather, let us provide a framework for what we want to do in the future, and then as we progressively unroll that over 10, 20 years, we'll provide more detail. A good example is potentially building a road like the ETA. When council designates that, we might be 10 years, 15 years away from actually building it. You don't have all that design detail right up front. So, as I say, all we've done really is strengthen our position, which was already in there, around supporting the government in terms of not requiring all of that information right up front of the process. That's probably enough from me. Is there any questions?
Oh, no, it's not necessarily a question, but is Norris's just another RMA term for notices, or?
I cringe when I saw that.
We've all written big T's on our book.
Yeah, I know.
As with regards to requiring and non-requiring authorities, is it of concern to this council when one of the major miners of water or geothermal energy bypasses the local government in their consent process?
That's a curly one. Council still has the opportunity to be involved in the process, and in the case of Tahara 2, we were involved as a submitter. We were also involved in terms of providing some technical advice to the ultimate decision makers. So it wasn't that the community was cut out, we just had a different role. I guess what the Board of Inquiry process is all about is saying, here's a piece of infrastructure, be it a power station or a road or a power line, which is of such national significance that we need to elevate it from a council hearing to a single hearing by qualified people, often involving judges, who are then able to make one decision and one final decision. And it stops that sort of re-litigation process which we've had in the past. I think Mighty River Power's reconsenting back in 2003 was an example where they went through the local government hearings and then got embroiled in the appeal process with a number of submitters who were a bit disgruntled. That was ultimately resolved without going to the Environment Court, but it involved a lot of time and cost, particularly for that power provider. So it's not perfect, and there are pros and cons, but I'd suggest that when we're talking about items of national significance, the process they've got actually works quite well. What I was slightly concerned about, and we've made a note in here, is making sure that there are good controls over how that requiring authority status is used. And a good comment which comes through here is around the ability to designate a natural resource. There has been some discussion in the past about the ability of a requiring authority to actually designate a natural resource, and a geothermal field might be an example. Once you start designating those natural resources, be it a lake or a geothermal field, you start to get into some really tricky issues around private property rights and impacting on the wider public good. So while it hasn't been overtly pushed by the government as part of this document, we've just restated that position, that concern.
Okay, any other further questions? Okay, Councillor Henderson?
Yeah, I'd just like to draw people's attention to the fact that this review is really far-ranging and quite significant in terms of the Resource Management Act, which is considered, despite all the problems that people do have with it at times, as a world-leading piece of legislation. And I'm not sure how carefully people have read it, but in particular if they have a look at what the council officers here have referred to as the degrading of section 6.6 and 7 of the Act, in particular in relation to consultation and that sort of thing. There's various things in here that are really important and critical going forward, because a lot of this revolves around how you designate what national interest actually is and what's considered to be in the national interest. And I note also, if you see page 615, council's officers have commented here on, in response to these suggestions or this paper, is, quote, however, large infrastructure projects often affect the wider community as a whole, and therefore constraints on the notification process would be inappropriate. So I just ask people to, take note and realise that, in many intents and purposes, in my opinion, what this is about is, rightly or wrongly, lessening the role of public consultation in these projects and fast-tracking things for better or for worse. And that's all I have to say on it, really. But I did have one question in particular. If you go to 6/10, I was curious as to why options to improve the quality of urban design. And it talks here about extending the scope of the Public Works Act to ensure that local authorities are able to compulsorily acquire and amalgamate land for major urban regeneration projects provided, etc. And then I was curious as to why Maori land is not able to be compulsorily acquired under any circumstances.
There's other pieces of legislation currently in force, which mean that essentially any Māori land, multiply owned Māori land, can't be alienated. And so under the Te Whenua Māori Land Act, I think it is, that's an existing piece of legislation and something that's been put in place. And then probably as a result of that, there were some constitutional issues if they wanted to then go and change that now.
Sorry, I should have just clarified, picking up on Councillor Henderson's comments. Just in terms of process, the submissions on this discussion document close on the 17th, so that's next Friday. The government then goes away and does some work in terms of drafting up legislation, and they're signalling about mid-2011 coming out with some legislative changes, which might not just be the RMA, might also be the Local Government Act and the Public Works Act, and the Land Transport Management Act as well, potentially. There's likely to be a select committee process and the ability for further formal submissions as part of that exercise as well. But we thought, certainly as officers, that it was important that we expressed a view, given, as you say, the wide-ranging impacts of this potential reform.
All right, no further questions. We will move and ask for a mover and a seconder to the suggested resolution, which is that a letter to the Ministry for the Environment attached to the Officer's Report of 10 December 2010 be approved for submission.
Amended.
Be approved as amended for submission. Okay, move to that, please. Good. Move. Second, please. Councillor Johnson, all in favour? Carried. Thank you very much, Mr. Carroll.
Thank you.